In October every year, Sweden, a small country in Northern Europe, makes an announcement that celebrates the most important achievements of humanity. It is called the Nobel Prize. For more than a century, this prize has been the world's highest recognition for breakthroughs in science, literature, peace, and economics. The announcements are made in Stockholm and Oslo, followed by ceremonies where laureates are honored not just with medals and money, but with a place in history. Winning a Nobel Prize is not about prestige alone. It signals that your work has changed the course of human knowledge and progress. In over a century of Nobel Prizes, since 1901, more than 600 laureates have been awarded in the sciences. America alone has more than 400. Tiny Switzerland, with a population smaller than Lagos, has dozens. Even Israel, a nation not much older than Nigeria's independence, has 12. And yet, the entire African continent, home to 1.4 billion people, 54 countries, and some of the oldest centers of human knowledge, has won 0 Nobel Prizes in physics, chemistry, or medicine. Not one. Not a single one. It is a staggering reality. How is it that a continent rich in diamonds, oil, gold, and even uranium, resources that powered the very scientific revolutions that won others Nobel Prizes, has not produced a single Nobel laureate in the science? Is Africa simply incapable of producing world-class scientists? Or is the problem deeper? A systemic failure that has made Africa the consumer but never the producer of the world's biggest discoveries? The Nobel Prize was born out of one man's guilt. Alfred Nobel, the Swedish chemist who invented dynamite, spent his life surrounded by explosives and profit. But when a premature obituary once described him as a merchant of death, Nobel panicked about how history would remember him. In his will of 1895, he left most of his fortune to establish a prize that will honor those who, in his own words, have conferred the greatest benefit to mankind. Since the first awards in 1901, the Nobel Prize in Physics, Chemistry, and Physiology or Medicine has become the ultimate validation of scientific achievement. It is not just a medal, it is history's way of saying, this discovery changed humanity. Think about some of the names etched into its legacy. Marie Curie, who pioneered research on radioactivity, changing medicine and energy forever. Alexander Fleming, who discovered penicillin and opened the antibiotic era. Albert Einstein, whose theory of photoelectric effect unlocked modern physics and eventually quantum mechanics. Francis Crick and Jim Watson, who uncovered the structure of DNA, the very code of life. These prizes are more than accolades. They are markers of civilizational progress, evidence that a society has nurtured minds capable of reshaping the world. Which brings us to the uncomfortable question. If the Nobel Prize is a measure of who moves humanity forward, what does it mean that Africa is entirely absent from the sciences? To understand just how glaring Africa's absence is, we need to zoom out and look at the global map of Nobel Science laureates. Since 1901, the Nobel committees in Stockholm and Oslo have handed out more than 600 prizes in physics, chemistry, and medicine. But the distribution is far from equal. The United States dominates the list. With over 400 laureates in the sciences alone, America accounts for more than half of all Nobel Prizes ever awarded in this field. Think about that. One country, less than 250 years old, has produced more Nobel-winning discoveries than the rest of the world combined. The explanation is clear. Massive investment in research, universities like Harvard, MIT, and Stanford, and a system that attracts the best minds from across the globe. Europe is the next giant. Germany, once home to Max Planck and Werner Heisenberg, has more than 100 Nobel Prizes in sciences. The United Kingdom, the birthplace of Newton's legacy, has around 90. France boasts about 70. Even war-torn 20th century Europe, rebuilding from the rubble of 2 world wars, continued to push the boundaries of discovery. Then there are the smaller nations that punch far above their weight. Switzerland, with a population of just 9 million, smaller than Lagos in size, has produced over 20 laureates in the sciences. Israel, a country younger than many African nations, has more than 12 Nobel Prizes across science and economics. Japan, devastated by nuclear war in 1945, has gone on to win 30 plus Nobel Prizes in science, and most of them after 2000. Now contrast this with Africa, a continent of 54 nations, 1.4 billion people, and the cradle of human civilization has produced 0 Nobel Prizes in science. None in physics, none in chemistry, none in medicine. It's not as if Africa lacks intellectuals or universities. South Africa, Egypt, and Nigeria boast some of the oldest and largest universities on the continent. African scientists have made contributions from studying malaria and HIV to advances in astronomy in South Africa to crop science research in Nigeria. Yet when it comes to Nobel recognition, they are invincible. The imbalance is not just about prestige, it raises uncomfortable questions. How can an entire continent become epicenters of global knowledge while Africa remains on the sidelines? Why has Africa been excluded from the world's highest stage of science for over a century? The numbers force us to admit Africa's absence is not by accident, it is systemic. The absence of African Nobel laureates in science is not because Africans lack talent or intellect. It is because of systemic failures that choke talent before it can blossom. And in this video, we'll unpack all of them. The first is weak research infrastructure. Nobel Prizes are not won by lone geniuses scribbling equations in isolation. They are won in labs, universities, and institutions that are properly funded, connected to global networks. Africa invests on average 0.5% of GDP in research and development. Compare this to 2.8% in the United States, 3.1% in Germany, and 4.8% in Israel. In practical terms, this means that while African universities struggle with outdated laboratories, their peers in Europe and Asia work with particle accelerators, billion-dollar telescopes, and genetic engineering facilities. UNESCO once warned that Africa cannot compete in science without radical increase in research and development funding. The second reason is the brain drain, the great talent exodus. When Africans do excel, they often do so abroad. Over 20,000 professionals leave Africa every year for Europe and the United States. The brightest scientists often find themselves working under foreign institutions that claim the credit when Nobel-level research is done. Take the example of Ahmed Zewail, an Egyptian-born scientist who won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1999 for his pioneering work in femtochemistry. Though born and raised in Egypt, his Nobel was attributed to his work at the California Institute of Technology in the United States. Had he stayed in Cairo, would he have had the tools or networks to reach that level? Most likely not. Brain drain means Africa's talent fuel other continents' Nobel counts. Thirdly, colonial legacy. Colonial education in Africa was never designed to produce inventors. It was designed to produce clerks, administrators, and low-level professionals to serve the empire. The culture of scientific inquiry was absent. Ngugi or Thiong'o once remarked that colonial schools taught Africans to look outside themselves for knowledge and validation. That legacy persists till date. Many African universities still rely heavily on foreign aid and imported curricula, rarely producing the kind of independent research that changes the world. The fourth reason is political instability and misplaced priorities. Science thrives on stability. It needs decades of consistent funding, leadership, and peace. But in too many African countries, political upheavals constantly reset progress. Military coups in West Africa disrupt universities and research funding. Corruption diverts resources away from labs into private pockets. Leaders often prioritize vanity projects over long-term investment in sciences. As Callistus Juma, the Kenyan scholar at Harvard, put it, African government treats science as luxury, not as a foundation of development. And the fifth, isolation from global scientific network. The Nobel Prize are often about visibility. Discoveries don't just have to be made, they have to be recognized. African scientists working in underfunded universities with limited access to global journals or conferences are cut off from the networks where recognition happens. This isolation creates a vicious cycle. Africa produces fewer landmark papers, fewer citations, fewer global partnerships, and therefore no Nobel Prizes. The conclusion is stark. Africa does not lack brilliant minds. It lacks systems that nurture, showcase, and reward brilliance. At first glance, one might think, so what? Medal from Stockholm doesn't feed people or build roads? But Africa's absence from the Nobel Science Prizes is a symptom of something deeper, a crisis in the continent's knowledge economy. First, Africa has knowledge dependency program. Without cutting-edge research, Africa becomes permanently dependent on others for technology, medicine, and industrial growth. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Africa had to import over 99% of its vaccines. Even diseases that affect Africans disproportionately, like malaria, rely heavily on Western laboratories for treatment and breakthroughs. In technology, Africa spends billions importing mobile phones, solar panels, and software instead of producing them locally. In other words, Africa does not control the knowledge that shapes its destiny. Secondly, this is lost economic opportunities. Scientific breakthroughs aren't just academic, they drive economies. Penicillin created entire pharmaceutical industries. The discovery of DNA revolutionized medicine and biotech. The transistor, born in Bell Labs, gave birth to Silicon Valley. By failing to nurture Nobel-level science, Africa misses out on industries that create wealth and jobs. Instead of exporting software, biotechnology, or green tech, Africa still largely exports raw materials, oil, cocoa, gold, the same commodities it exported a century ago. Africa produces what it does not consume, consumes what it does not produce. That imbalance is knowledge-driven. Also, shows geopolitical weakness. In today's world, power is not just measured in armies but in laboratories. Nations that crack nuclear physics control nuclear weapons. Nations that mastered genetics now control food supply chains. Nations that dominated artificial intelligence will lead the next century. Africa without Nobel-level research risks remaining at the mercy of others in every future global revolution. And this also sends cultural signals. Nobel Prizes are also cultural signals. They show a society's capacity to push the frontier of human possibility. The absence of Africans in the sciences is not just a gap in recognition. It is a loud reminder that the continent has not yet built the system that allows the brightest minds to shine on the world stage. As one commentator once put it with biting honesty, when your best paid scientists are politicians and not scientists, don't be surprised when the Nobel Prize passes you by. This is why Africa's void matters. It is not about Stockholm. It is about the continent's place in the hierarchy of global knowledge and progress. So, how can Africa change this? If Africa's absence from Nobel Science Prizes is systemic, then the remedy must also be systemic. The continent cannot wait for a lone genius to emerge. It must build the ecosystem that makes Nobel-level breakthrough possible. So how can it do this? First, it must invest in research and development. The first step is money. No society produces groundbreaking sciences on charity alone. Africa invests less than 0.5% of its GDP in research and design. Compare that with 4.8% in Israel, 3.4% in South Korea, and 2.8% in the United States. South Korea in the 1960s was poorer than Ghana, but by pouring billions into science and technology, it transformed into a global innovation hub. Today, it leads in semiconductors, biotech, and AI, and its scientists are Nobel contenders. If Africa matched even 1% of its GDP in research and design, it would unleash billions of dollars yearly into labs and universities. Secondly, it should strengthen universities into research powerhouse. African universities must evolve from degree factories into innovation engines. The University of Cape Town, Makerere University in Uganda, and the University of Ibadan once had global reputations, but decades of underfunding eroded them. Africa needs institutions like MIT or ETH, Zurich, places where the best students and scientists converge, funded to pursue risky frontier research. Regional centers of excellence in medicine, physics, AI, and agriculture will pool resources across borders. And thirdly, it must reverse the brain drain. Africa must stop bleeding its brightest minds to the West. Incentives, competitive salaries, grants, and labs can attract African scientists abroad to return home. Countries like China and India created reverse brain drain programs, luring back top researchers with funding and prestige. Africa can do the same. Fourthly, build Pan-African scientific collaboration. No single African country can carry the burden alone, but together 54 nations can. Imagine a Pan-African research fund where each country contributes a fraction of GDP to create shared mega labs. Imagine a continental fellowship program that lets African scientists rotate between Lagos, Nairobi, Cairo, and Cape Town, building networks as strong as Europe's. All this will lead to massive changes and result in innovations that will change Africa, change the world. And fifth, Africa must change political priorities. Science must become a matter of political will. Leaders must realize that Nobel-level research isn't a luxury, it is the foundation of sovereignty in the 21st century. When India invested in atomic research, it was mocked as a poor country playing with physics. Today, it has a space program landing on the moon. When Rwanda invested in drones to deliver medical supplies, skeptics laughed. Today, it is a model studied worldwide. African countries can make similar bold bets. And we must cultivate a culture of scientific celebration. Africa must celebrate its scientists with the same intensity it celebrates its musicians or footballers. Young Africans must grow up dreaming not only of being Burna Boy or Drogba, but also of being the next Marie Curie or Albert Einstein. Nations become great not because of what they buy from others, but because of what they make of themselves. Africa will win the Nobel Prize in science not when Stockholm decides to reward it, but when African nations decide that science is as important as politics, music, or football. Why has no African won the Nobel Prize in the sciences? It's not because the continent lacks genius. It is because genius has been stifled by weak institutions, chronic underfunding, political instability, and a culture that elevates politicians above scientists. But history shows us that this can change. South Korea, Israel, Singapore, all once written off as poor, peripheral, turned deliberate investment in science into global breakthroughs. If they could rise from poverty to Nobel level prestige, then so can Africa. The Nobel Prize is more than a medal. It's a mirror that reflects society's ability to push the boundaries of knowledge. For over a century, Africa's reflection has been absent. That absence is not just embarrassing, it is dangerous. Because in the 21st century, the nations that control science will control the future. The question then is not whether Africa can produce Nobel-level science. It can. The real question is whether African government, universities, and societies will finally build the system to make it possible. And perhaps the harshest truth of all is this: Africa will win the Nobel Prize in science the day it begins to value the scientist more than the politician. Thank you for watching this episode. If you enjoyed it, share with someone. Give the video a thumbs up. And until I see you again, bye bye.